You're standing in a crowded room. Everyone is facing one direction, staring at a blank wall. No one speaks. No one questions. No one turns around. And when you finally muster the courage to ask why, they look at you as if you've committed a crime. Their silence says it all. We don't ask that here. What's more terrifying, the fact that no one knows the reason, or that no one wants to know. Now imagine this. Every major decision in your life, your job, your values, your beliefs, even your definition of success has been shaped by people who were also just staring at walls, mimicking, nodding, obeying, without realizing it. You inherited their conclusions like hand-me-down clothes. You didn't choose the shape of your mind. It was tailored for you. And here's the paradox. We live in an age that glorifies individuality, yet almost no one truly thinks individually. You pride yourself on having your own opinions. But how many of those opinions have you dissected from the inside out brutally, unapologetically until they bleed truth, or crumble under scrutiny? Or did they just arrive in you from school, from media, from friends, from the algorithm, from the culture that wrapped you before you even had language? Here's the uncomfortable reality. The vast majority of people don't think for themselves, not because they're incapable, but because thinking is painful. Independent thought requires the courage to be exiled, misunderstood, and mentally alone. It's a kind of death, the death of belonging, the death of certainty. And most people would rather die a slow internal death than face the terror of true mental freedom, because to think for yourself means you are responsible now. You can no longer blame the system, the parents, the church, the school, the party, the group. Once you awaken your mind, the comforting illusion of collective agreement evaporates. You are alone with reality, and reality raw, unfiltered, inconvenient is far harder to digest than the stories we're spoon-fed from birth. Why do you believe what you believe? Why do you not believe other things? What if your most sacred truths are inherited lies? What if your certainty is just socially reinforced illusion? What if your mind is not your own? You're told what to care about. You're told what success looks like. You're told who to be angry at, who to praise, who to mock, who to love, and who to fear. You're told what's normal and what makes someone crazy, all under the guise of freedom. And even now, as you listen, your mind is filtering this through the beliefs you already hold. It wants to agree or disagree, to label this as wise or foolish, helpful or offensive. But stop. Don't label it yet. Just notice how hard it is to let a thought exist without immediately comparing it to the archive inside your head. What is that archive? Who put it there? And why are you still living by its rules? If none of this unsettles you, you're either completely free or entirely trapped. So here's the question echoing behind all this. What if thinking for yourself is the one rebellion most people never dare to commit? Let's dig into why. You weren't born with a belief system. You were born into one. Before you even learned how to walk, your mind began absorbing the gestures of your parents, the emotional temperature of your home, the expectations in their eyes. Long before you could reason, you conformed. And this right here is the root of the problem. We mistake the ability to think for the act of thinking. You were trained to obey before you were trained to reflect. The world needed you socialized quickly, not to be fully conscious, not to be inwardly liberated, but to function, to fit, to follow. And this system runs deep. Psychologist Carl Jung spoke of the collective unconscious, the inherited psychic residue of our ancestors, of societies long gone but still present in us. You carry stories that were never yours, fears you never questioned, desires installed in you like software before you knew what was being downloaded. You learned without words what was safe to say, what was safe to feel, and more disturbingly, what was safe to think. You were told what good people think. You were shown what happens to those who deviate. And in that silent transaction, the soul of independent thought was traded for the currency of acceptance. Arthur Schopenhauer once wrote, "The greatest of follies is to sacrifice health for any other kind of happiness." But what about sacrificing truth for belonging? We do it every day, at dinner tables, in classrooms, in churches, in voting booths, on social media. We parrot what we've heard. We conform to survive the moment, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, we forget how to think from within. And then comes the seduction of authority. In his chilling experiments, psychologist Stanley Milgram revealed something haunting. Most people will obey an authority figure even to the point of inflicting harm simply because they're told to. Why? Because the burden of thinking is too heavy. It's easier to outsource moral responsibility than to carry it alone. This isn't just obedience. It's a psychological fracture. Aldous Huxley warned of this in Brave New World. Not a world of oppression through force, but of seduction through pleasure. A world where truth is drowned in amusement, where people don't need to be controlled, they're too busy being entertained. If Orwell feared a world where books were banned, Huxley feared one where no one wanted to read them. And here we are. You don't need to censor ideas if no one's interested in thinking. You just have to make thinking uncomfortable, or worse, irrelevant. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that human beings are condemned to be free, that we are thrust into a world where we must choose, must create meaning in a universe that offers none. But most don't want that freedom. They want templates, presets, labels, guidance. We want to be told who we are, so we never have to risk discovering the terrifying truth that identity is not found, but forged in struggle, solitude, and self-inquiry. Even education, the very system meant to liberate minds, often does the opposite. Instead of teaching you how to think, it teaches you what to think. You are rewarded for repeating, not questioning, punished for deviating, not exploring. The student who conforms gets the grade. The one who rebels is labeled difficult, not because they're wrong, but because they disrupt the structure one built not for thought, but for production. What we call critical thinking is often just critical mimicking, regurgitating approved skepticism within the boundaries set by those in charge. True independent thought, that's rare, because it's dangerous. It cannot be predicted. It cannot be easily controlled. Viktor Frankl, a man who survived the horrors of the Holocaust, later wrote that between stimulus and response, there lies a space, and in that space lies our power to choose. But how many of us ever enter that space? Most react, most absorb, most repeat. Few pause long enough to find that sacred silence where you can choose, not based on what you've been told, but on what you've discovered. This is the hidden architecture of the mind, designed, shaped, and managed by forces most never detect. And so we must ask, if the thoughts you think were shaped by systems you didn't choose, can you still call them your own? If your deepest values were installed before you knew how to question them, who would you be without them? And if independent thought is the foundation of real freedom, what then does that make conformity? We haven't even begun to see the full cost of this mental outsourcing, but we will, because the consequences are everywhere, beneath the surface of our relationships, our politics, our fears, and our dreams. Most just never realize it. Now we pull back the curtain. Now we see what happens when no one thinks for themselves, not just in theory, but in the raw fabric of life itself. You walk into a room filled with people. They're laughing, scrolling, debating, consuming, each with their own opinions, preferences, and ideals. But something feels off. You listen. Everyone is speaking, but no one is saying anything. Not really. The same recycled arguments. The same headlines repackaged as personal insights. The same outrage, like an echo chamber on loop. And then it hits you. Most people aren't thinking, they're downloading. They mistake imitation for identity, reaction for reason, validation for truth. This is the quiet catastrophe, not a war you can see, but a slow erosion of the individual mind, one meme, one algorithm, one trending topic at a time. Because when no one thinks for themselves, something far worse than ignorance spreads. Consensus without consciousness. Let's peel back the layers. At first, it seems harmless. You follow the crowd. You echo popular opinions. You find safety in the herd. But every time you outsource your thoughts to someone else, whether it's a political pundit, a spiritual leader, or a charismatic influencer, you lose something sacred, your inner compass. Over time, your mind becomes a mirror, not a source, but a reflection. You don't create thought, you relay it. And the scariest part, you don't even realize it's happening. This is how propaganda works, not through force, but through familiarity. The more you hear something, the more true it feels. Psychologists call it the illusory truth effect. Your brain doesn't care if something is true. It cares if it's easy to process. Repetition is comfortable. Contradiction is threatening. So, you scroll, you like, you repeat, and slowly, the edge of your own voice dulls into silence. But the consequences go deeper. When you don't think for yourself, your relationships become transactional. You don't connect soul to soul, you connect ideology to ideology. You surround yourself with people who think like you because it feels safe. Dissent becomes danger. Disagreement becomes betrayal. Dialogue collapses into tribalism. Entire communities form, not around truth, but around shared illusions. And when those illusions are threatened, outrage, division, dehumanization. This is why society feels so fractured. Not because people are thinking too much, but because they're thinking the same. Individuality becomes aesthetic, not essence. You wear different clothes. You post unique captions. But deep down, the architecture of your mind was designed by someone else. You've adopted narratives that were handed to you by culture, tradition, media, or trauma without ever asking, does this actually belong to me? And then there's the mind-numbing effect of digital culture. Attention spans are splintered. Depth is drowned in a sea of distraction. Critical thought requires time, silence, discomfort. But everything around you is designed to keep you stimulated, not thoughtful. You are fed what to think before you even ask a question. Algorithms know your fears before you do. They serve content that confirms your bias. They guide your thoughts like invisible shepherds. You've never felt more informed, and yet, never been more mentally passive. And this has a psychological cost. When you don't think for yourself, you feel a creeping sense of powerlessness. You live reactively, not intentionally. You start to wonder why you're anxious, why you're restless, why you feel empty even when you have everything. It's because you've abandoned the very process that gives life meaning. The ability to shape your own beliefs. You were meant to wrestle with truth, to dig through discomfort, to hold competing ideas in tension until clarity emerged. But instead, you've been conditioned to choose convenience over confrontation. But confrontation is where the mind is forged. Without it, you become emotionally fragile, intellectually numb, spiritually shallow. And here's the most haunting consequence of all. When you don't think for yourself, someone else will, and they will do it in their own interest. History is filled with regimes, cults, and corporations that thrived on mental passivity. From Hitler's Germany to corporate advertising to social media empires, the formula is always the same. Keep people distracted, emotionally reactive, and intellectually dependent, because a person who doesn't think for themselves is easy to control. They can be sold anything, convinced of anything, turned against anyone. All you need is the right narrative and an absence of inner clarity. You don't need chains to enslave the mind, just distraction, just comfort, just fear. You begin to lose not only your independence but your ability to even desire it. You forget that life can be more than consensus, that truth is not what is agreed upon, but what is discovered, often in isolation, often in darkness, often in painful rebirth. You forget that your thoughts, your beliefs, your values should be the result of conscious inquiry, not unconscious inheritance. So the question now sharpens. If the mind is the seat of your freedom, what happens when that seat is occupied? Who are you without your own thoughts? What becomes of a world where no one thinks for themselves? We're about to find out. Because there is only one way out of this labyrinth, and it begins with rebellion, not against systems, or ideologies, or institutions, but rebellion against passivity. Rebellion doesn't always begin with a raised fist. Sometimes it begins with a question whispered in the privacy of your own mind, a single defiant thought, a refusal to blindly accept. And that, though silent, though invisible, is the most dangerous act in a world engineered to keep you compliant. You see, true rebellion is not the performance of anger. It's the reclamation of your own consciousness. When you think for yourself, you become unpredictable. You can't be herded into ideologies. You can't be baited by outrage. You can't be seduced by groupthink. You become something rare, a sovereign mind. And nothing frightens systems of control more than that. But how do you break free when everything around you is designed to keep you tethered? You start by unlearning obedience. That doesn't mean becoming chaotic or reckless. It means learning to pause before you believe, to challenge even your most sacred assumptions, to get comfortable with cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort of holding to conflicting ideas in your mind. Most people flee from that tension. You won't. You'll lean into it, because that tension, that's where real thought is born. Take Viktor Frankl, survivor of Auschwitz, father of logotherapy. He wrote, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. That space, infinitesimal, invisible, is the battlefield of your mind. And the first act of rebellion is this: expand that space. When something triggers you, pause. When something seduces you, pause. When the crowd moves in one direction, pause. In that pause, you ask the questions that most people avoid. Why do I believe this? Where did this idea come from? Who benefits from me thinking this way? And what if the opposite is also true? These questions are weapons, not to destroy others, but to dismantle the mental cages you never knew you were locked inside. But it's not enough to question. You must also build. You replace borrowed beliefs with forged ones. You study not to echo, but to understand. You read those you disagree with. You sit with ideas that unsettle you. You journal not for clarity, but for confrontation. You begin to see thinking not as a luxury, but as a moral responsibility. Carl Jung said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. You will not be one of those people. You will face your soul, even when it reveals contradictions, even when it challenges your identity, even when it shatters the stories you've clung to for safety. Because freedom isn't safety, it's responsibility. To rebel is to accept that responsibility, to live without a script, to stop outsourcing your life to authority figures, popular culture, or ideological tribes. It means taking full ownership of your worldview, crafting it like an artist, questioning it like a scientist, living it like a warrior. That's what thinkers like Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and Huxley understood. That autonomy doesn't come cheap. It costs comfort. It costs approval. It costs certainty. But what you gain is worth everything. You gain clarity not just of thought, but of vision. You begin to see how much of life is a performance, how often fear masquerades as morality, and how rarely people ask why they do what they do. You gain power not over others, but over yourself. The power to sit with doubt, the power to make unpopular choices, the power to follow your own compass in a world screaming at you to follow theirs. And most importantly, you gain integrity. The word comes from the Latin integer, meaning whole. When you think for yourself, you become whole. You are not a collection of contradictions stuffed into a persona. You are a single, coherent being unified by principles you chose, not ones you inherited. But don't be naive. This rebellion is lonely. Most people won't understand you. Many will mock you. Some will call you arrogant, difficult, even dangerous. But that's the price of thinking independently in a world that feeds on conformity. You must become comfortable being the outsider, like Socrates, who was executed for corrupting the minds of the youth by teaching them to think, like Galileo, who was imprisoned for believing the earth moved around the sun, like Kierkegaard, who lived as a pariah because his philosophy refused to bow to the religious norms of his day. All of them understood one truth. To live authentically, you must sometimes walk alone. But you won't be alone forever, because something extraordinary happens when you rebel not just against the world, but for your own mind. You give others permission to do the same. Your courage becomes a mirror. Your clarity becomes a torch. You start a fire not of destruction, but of illumination. And slowly, others begin to question, to pause, to reclaim. One by one, the spell of conformity begins to break. But for now, your war is within. The voices in your head will resist. The comforts will tempt. The crowd will beckon. Don't flinch. Don't fold. Don't follow. You are the rebellion. And the world is about to remember what one awakened mind can do. And now at the edge of everything you stand before the final mirror. The rebellion is not against society or media or education or even authority. Those were just the visible shadows. The true rebellion is against yourself, the self that was never truly yours. Because here's the final truth no one wants to face. You were never taught how to think. You were trained how to obey. From your earliest moments, the wiring began. You were rewarded for compliance, not curiosity. Praised for answers, not questions. Conditioned to believe that truth lived outside of you in textbooks, in experts, in traditions, in the collective. But the raw, unwelcome truth. No one can give you your mind. You must take it. You must strip it back from the echoes of other people's beliefs, from the theater of politics and pop culture, from the seduction of certainty and the drug of validation. And you do that by facing the most terrifying question a person can ask. What if I've never had a single original thought? Sit with that, not to punish yourself, but to awaken. Because this is where liberation begins, not with confidence, but with collapse. Collapse of the illusions, collapse of the ego, collapse of the artificial identity you were handed and told to defend. This is the sacred moment when you realize you were born into a maze and told it was the world, a maze of expectations, roles, ideologies, and all your life you've been running thinking you're chasing freedom, when in truth, you were chasing approval. But now the chase ends, because the deepest realization isn't about breaking free from the world. It's about breaking free from the false self you became to survive it. You were not born to be a parrot of consensus. You were born to see, to observe the invisible, to feel the ineffable, to think not in the mechanical way of regurgitating information, but in the ancient way, as a quest, as a path, as a fire. Thinking isn't something you do, it's something you become. A thinker is not someone with answers. A thinker is someone who has made peace with the weight of endless questions and still chooses to carry them. Someone who no longer seeks comfort in agreement, but seeks truth wherever it hides, even when it costs them everything. Because that is the ultimate cost, your illusions. You lose your identity, your tribe, your borrowed certainty. But in that loss, something extraordinary happens. You become real, not as a label, not as a role, not as a curated version of what society told you was acceptable, but as yourself, raw, awake, untamed. You begin to see the world not through lenses handed to you, but through your own unfiltered perception. You notice how often people speak, but don't say anything. How often they argue, but never listen. How often they believe, but never ask why. And in that space of awareness, you stop reacting. You stop performing. You stop playing the game. You start living, not according to inherited scripts, but by intuition, discernment, and hard-won insight. You begin to really choose what you believe, how you act, what you value. And even when you're wrong, and you'll know it was your mistake. And there is great dignity in that, because the goal is not to be perfect. The goal is to be real. And nothing is more real than a mind that has chosen itself. That is the final, most powerful realization. You are not your thoughts. You are the thinker, and you get to choose the voice in your head. Most people spend their lives haunted by thoughts they didn't choose, driven by beliefs they never examined, echoing opinions they never understood. But not you, because you saw the maze. You saw the spell, and you broke it. Now your mind is yours. And when your mind is yours, everything changes. You speak differently. You love differently. You suffer differently. You see differently. You become unshakable not because you have all the answers, but because you finally know how to ask the right questions. And when you meet others like you recognize them instantly, not by their appearance, not by their status, but by their eyes that have seen too much, questioned too deeply, and come out on the other side. Eyes that don't seek to dominate or persuade, but simply to understand, because that is what thinking is for. Not to win arguments, but to touch truth. Not to look superior, but to see clearly. Not to separate ourselves from the world, but to see ourselves within it, finally whole, finally awake. So here you are, at the end of the maze, no longer a puppet of your programming, no longer a soldier in the war of borrowed beliefs. You are something else now, something rare, something sacred. You are a thinker, and in a world that worships noise, you chose silence. In a world that rewards echo, you chose depth. In a world that fears the mirror, you chose to look. That is no small thing. That is a revolution, and it begins with you.